CEO turnover is the highest it's been in nearly 25 years.
There's a ton of pressure on those at the top, with some factors making the jobs less attractive, all while making boards a bit impatient with those in the C-suite.
And that's leading companies to rethink everything, from succession plans to compensation.
So what's changed?
And where's the next generation of leadership coming from?
We're talking about the high-stakes game of CEO succession planning and why it's not just an HR problem.
Welcome to the pre-read.
Just like the slides you get before a big meeting, the pre-read prepares you, CFOs and other executives, for the next big thing. It's the global podcast where finance, sustainability, audit, and risk come together in the C-suite.
If you're making decisions at scale or need to understand the leaders who are, you're in the right place. This is the pre-read, brought to you by Workiva.
I'm Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado.
And I'm Alyssa Zucker, sustainability nerd and equal opportunist caffeine addict. Today, we're joined by Catherine Tsai. Catherine, can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I'm Catherine Tsai. I'm a former reporter and current content producer at Workiva and a lover of a venti soy chai.
Well, later in the episode, we'll hear from Emily Forrester, Workiva's Chief People Officer. But first, Catherine, you sat down with Tim Paradis, Future of Work correspondent at Business Insider. Tell us, what were some of the key takeaways from that discussion?
I spoke to Tim about turnover among CEOs, which has been happening quite a bit lately. My main takeaways were, 1, CEO turnover is surging. He says 646 CEOs left U.S. companies in the first quarter, which was a record. 2, there's a gap in succession planning. Some companies have weak leadership pipelines. But the CFO path is real. Tim says CFOs and COOs are strong springboards to the top job.
Well, I thought you had a terrific discussion, and I will confess for our audience that there's a certain couple that was made famous at a Coldplay concert that had a lot of us laughing at memes over the weekend, but it really got us to thinking, what exactly does CEO succession look like, particularly when it's, say, unplanned, as it sounds like that one was in that instance?
Yeah, I think it brings up a really good point here around, frankly, this being a risk management strategy, right? And so when you have such a critical role and things happen, unplanned or not, you can't just rely on the means to kind of make it through that process. You're going to want to have a solid strategy and program in place. So yeah, I guess we could talk about memes probably forever, but we could maybe spare our audience, or should we do it?
Well, I just need to say the funniest meme that I got, because my brothers and I spent the entire weekend trading memes, and it was with a red-haired and yellow-dressed clown of one fast food chain with his arms around a red-haired but blue-dressed mascot, I guess you would say, from another fast food chain. I thought it was hysterical. I don't know, Alyssa, any call-outs?
Well, Steve, I don't know if this is going to show too much color into our personalities. But so while you were in fast food land, the funniest meme that I found was of the Screamer. If you're familiar, if you're an art history buff, as I am, but really funny, just graphic photo, because it actually depicts, if you're familiar with, it's Edward Munch, but if you're familiar with the scene, it's, a really horrified man screaming at like the daunting, sky. And I think that emotion of horror was pretty spot on.
I bet it was. Catherine, did you get any funny memes that weekend?
I didn't, but now I'm going to have to look them all up again.
I think it's been long enough that you could relive it.
All right, guys, let's get to it. Let's start with Tim Paradis.
Tim Paradis, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
There have been some high-profile CEO departures lately, such as the CEO at X has left, and then there was the small data company that Coldplay made famous that lost their CEO. And you point out that, of course, CEOs can leave for a variety of reasons, but turnover is the highest it's been in nearly 25 years. What's going on there?
There's a whole lot of forces that I think are making the job at the top maybe not as attractive to some people, and also making boards kind of impatient with those at the top. So there's real pressure on them, and both on boards and CEOs to perform or get out. But there's all sorts of stuff, right? So worries about the economy, uncertainty there, politics, tariffs, you name it, all of that uncertainty is really tough. Pandemic really ramped that pressure up, I think, for a lot of workers. And then so you also have activist investor pressure. There's a lot of impatience there. So again, they want CEOs to perform and get the numbers that they want. I touched on the pandemic, so there's burnout there, which a lot of workers have felt as well. And I think CEOs who know it's an always on job just at some point run out of juice a little bit. And then, there's been criticism of a lot of US companies that they don't do a good job with succession planning. But where you do see it happening, then you might have CEOs saying, okay, or you boards rather saying, okay, let's move it along and get the next, class in there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about succession planning. Why has it been so hard lately?
One recruiter I talked to a few times, who's a smart guy about this stuff, said he thinks in a lot of ways companies didn't do a good enough job with it because there was always this sense that you could just go out and poach the next hire somewhere else. But the problem is the sort of tragedy, the commons effect is like when nobody's doing succession planning, then you don't have that competitor to go to and poach a good person. I think it's also hard to do. And when boards are busy doing other things and C-suites are busy doing other things, that one of those things, I think it probably falls to the wayside a little bit too. There are always other fires to put out, and succession planning might feel like a nice to have for some companies.
Okay. Well, does that mean there's new opportunities for people maybe in that second or third layer of the C-suite?
I was looking at some data earlier from Challenger Gray and Christmas, the staffing firm, they do executive coaching and other stuff, I believe. But anyway, they're big on this kind of data. And, I think their numbers were basically in 2025 so far, it's been about half and half. So half of people have been internal promotions and half have been from outside of companies. But yeah, there's still definitely a pathway for people in the C-suite, particularly COO, Chief Operating Officer. That's definitely a that's long been a path to getting to the top job by the nature of the work, because you are running operations. And there's also good news for CFOs because there's so much focus on efficiency and finances and cost control that the CFO also feels like a reasonable heir apparent for a lot of boards to step into that CEO suite.
Nice. Well, what about like chief sustainability officers? Because people keep saying sustainability risks are business risks. Do they have a pathway to become a CEO, or is that still a little bit on the fringes?
I don't have good data on that, so I shouldn't speak to it too much. But my sense is when I just kind of scan corporate announcements, things like that, that would feel to me more like an outlier, certainly than a COO or a CFO would at this point. And I also do wonder, given the current political climate we're in the US, you could see a world where a board would be thinking, gosh, I don't know if this would look like a responsible decision to elevate somebody who's a chief sustainability officer versus a sort of tried and true COO or even a CFO.
So if you want to be a CEO and maybe middle management isn't quite the incubator that it used to be, what would you say is a good approach for putting yourself in position to become a CEO one day?
It's a few things that I suppose are good for anybody who wants to get ahead in their role. So building internal credibility within a company, within your industry, clearly getting to be known by the board and having ties with folks on the board would, you could be a fan favorite among board members if you establish yourself as being capable and good to work with. And I think another thing that may be interesting too is that there are more companies appointing CEOs on an interim basis. So those numbers have gone up a little bit, which kind of feels like try before you buy for some companies. And so I think clearly, if you're in an interim role and you demonstrate that you're effective, then it's a very natural progression for a board to then say, we're going to take the interim off of your title and just leave you as that new CEO. So, but I think that's certainly one avenue is if you can get yourself into any position where you are the de facto person, that would be helpful.
What about demographics wise? Who is the typical CEO?
I forget the exact number, but it's actually has not changed much. It's still usually, I believe it's still a man in his 50s is still sort of the prototypical CEO. And it hasn't, it's kind of changed surprisingly little over the decades. Over many decades, of course, there are more advances with women and people of color, things like that. But it's not a wholesale departure too.
Okay. So there's still a chance for me?
There's still a chance for you. Absolutely.
Anything else about CEOs that we haven't asked you?
I mean, it's hard to sort of say boohoo for the CEOs because, as we know, they often make hundreds of times what the average worker makes. So there is that. So the compensation is still very strong, but it is real that more CEOs are leaving. And I just was looking at some data on this. up 12% year over year from this time last year. So the first half of 2025. So we are seeing more of them head for the exits or being pushed out, right? Like I mentioned, because either boards or activist investors are unhappy. Perhaps the most famous CEO, Elon Musk, has said that being CEO sucks, so.
And yet he's CEO of so many companies.
And yet he's CEO of so many things. He said one time, what was it? He said, it's like looking into the abyss and chewing glass. That's what he compared it to. So we're on pace still to reach, the highest number for the S&P, but for the highest number since 2001, I think this year we're on pace for. So it's really, we're seeing quite a lot of turnover. And, and a lot of CEOs I speak to about this, about sort of when it's time to go. Some of them will just say it's not an easy decision because it's a cool job and they are really into the work and it's all consuming and it's got a lot of nice perks, not just the money, but, you're a bold-faced name. You get to go to fancy conferences. You get to go to the White House. You get to do all this sort of stuff. But a few CEOs I talked to recently for a piece were saying that, they kind of either thought they had a time limit. So maybe a couple of them told me 10 years. They felt like that was a good mark of, that's a good spot. To then say they're not too long in the tooth in the job and that they feel like they can be pretty effective without getting, without being outmoded, I suppose. And then one CEO who's a founder told me, she said, basically, as soon as you stop being afraid, that's when you should stop being a CEO, sort of. And she meant it in the sense of like having that healthy tension of like, I really need to make sure I'm on the top of my game. So
yeah,
it's kind of interesting to think about how people like that give up what is potentially the biggest job of their career and not an easy thing to do for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, hang in there, CEOs. That was Tim Paradis from Business Insider. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
88% of global professionals say AI is already driving ROI. But here's the catch. Only 1/3 have the data quality to use it well. In Workiva's latest global practitioner survey, 2,300 finance, audit, and sustainability pros shared how they're building value with AI amid uncertainty, with faster outputs, fewer manual tasks, and more strategic focus. You'll see what's working, where gaps remain, and how data integrity separates the leaders from those lagging behind. Read the full report at workiva.com/PR-building value. That's WORKIVA.com/PR-building value.
Our next guest is Emily Forrester, Workiva's Chief People Officer. Alyssa, you also had a great conversation with Emily. What did you take away?
I did. And I have to say, I always love talking to Emily. And some of the key takeaways that I took away from what was really a robust conversation. The first one, succession planning is risk management. CEO succession planning, it's not just HR's job. It's really a core risk process that protects the strategy and continuity of a business. The second one was that it's really CFOs that shape the pipeline. Finance leaders kind of have to pressure test the plan for diversity, cost, and long-term business scenarios as they consider different candidates and this whole succession planning. The third one is that communication builds trust, and that a clear, confident message to employees and investors is really critical to avoid disruption and reputational risk.
It was interesting to me to hear from Emily how boards don't have to select a CEO on their own. CFOs have a really important perspective to share.
Yeah, and I thought that point that she made about this being an ongoing process, I mean, certainly these executives have day jobs and there are other concerns that they have, but I think it's going to be problematic if you do find yourself in an unexpected CEO transition and you're now just dusting off a plan that may not have been looked at for months or even years. I think revisiting that on an ongoing basis is going to ensure that that critical succession process actually plays out to the company's favor, perhaps, as opposed to, at a minimum, being maybe status quo or risking perhaps a downturn of some sort.
Yeah, it all just makes a lot of sense to me when you think of the finance leader. Your job is to ensure business resilience, progress, success, expansion, etc. And what more important lever to pull than the actual leader of your company and having a continuity and kind of succession plan in place to, guide the company through any changes in that critical role.
Well, definitely. All right. Well, let's pull this lever and get to Alyssa's chat with Emily.
We are joined today by Emily Forrester, Chief People Officer of our very own Workiva. So, Emily, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, hi, Alyssa. Thanks for having me today. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, The chief people officer's focus is on the long-term health of the organization and its ability to execute on strategy through its people specifically. So where finance is focusing on capital and risk from a quantitative standpoint, it's the HR leaders that are providing qualitative perspective on the human capital that's driving that enterprise value, right? So from a business continuity standpoint, how do HR leaders ensure that CEO succession planning is tied to enterprise risk and value creation and not just talent development?
Well, CEO succession is a strategic risk management process at its core. It's definitely not just a talent pipeline exercise in any way. And I would say that succession planning is most clearly tied to enterprise risk when readiness is regularly reviewed through the lens of business continuity, not just individual capability. Of course, successors need to be reviewed based on their technical and leadership competencies, but also for their alignment to the company's long-term growth strategy. Does a successor understand what truly drives enterprise value? Do they focus on the right success metrics and trade-offs for the company's business model? Have they led strategic initiatives that align with where the company needs are and where the company is going? And ultimately then, succession plans are stress tested to contribute to risk mitigation efforts. It's common that there are several possible successors identified for any key position that could be tapped on in a variety of scenarios. It's what happens in a crisis. Who can step in now versus in 6 to 12 months? And I would say that as the people leader, there's an immense amount of collaboration across HR, across the board, across the C-suite of an organization to ensure that a succession plan for a CEO especially aligns with investor expectations, governance framework, long-term value drivers in order to put a comprehensive and robust plan together that will lead to value creation if and when that plan needs to be put into action.
So as you get those stakeholders together at the table, the C-suite, HR, finance, and you're going through the succession planning exercise at the proverbial table, or the tables over many months, I'm sure, what should CFOs be asking about or pushing in these conversations?
I think, first and foremost, I think CFOs can contribute an immense amount to ensuring that business leaders within their own company are well developed to understand capital allocation, margin discipline, investor communication. And as succession plan conversations come up, CFOs need to be aware of who needs more of that sort of development so that they can lean in. Strong CFOs are able to contribute to building that financial and business acumen across their company and with those identified successors through the communications and the talent development initiatives that they contribute to. Furthermore, a CFO may see and understand organizational risk very differently than others involved in the CEO succession decision. And I think a CFO's role is to challenge whether the leadership pipeline is diversified enough to withstand risk across economic cycles. CFOs should ask how succession planning aligns with financial materiality and future business scenarios. I think CFOs need to really have a strong sense of transparency in terms of what total cost of succession will look like so that they can take that into account, thinking about interim arrangements, external search costs, and retention needs for key talent within the organization who may be impacted. And a CFO should be pushing for clarity around what those financial metrics look like, because they will be accountable for assuring that those are upheld post-transition.
Okay, I want to go back to this point that you've mentioned on the total cost of succession and those financial metrics in a moment. But first, when the CEO exits unexpectedly, how do you communicate with employees and investors and all of the key stakeholders to maintain trust in the organization itself and in its key leadership as its figurehead and key leader has just exited? How do you navigate that to really limit reputational risk?
A lack of information fuels uncertainty. So it is important to move quickly, but communicate with precision when a CEO transition happens, especially when it happens unexpectedly. And when there is a well-designed succession plan in place, it makes it a lot easier to move with that precision that's necessary. So, legal, investor relations, HR, and the communications teams need to be very closely aligned on that action plan in order to ensure consistency across all of the channels that they'll be communicating through. Internally, to stakeholders within the organization, I think the message needs to focus on stability with some empathy, depending on the situation. I think it's important to acknowledge the disruption, but internal stakeholders need to hear leadership affirm the business continuity and reinforce the standards of the company culture. Externally, I think the organization has to send a message that signals continuity of strategy and governance. Again, varying by scenario and situation. But when you're executing on a well-prepared succession plan, you should be ready to highlight who's stepping in and why they're capable to build that investor confidence and trust in the succession event that's taking place. And here, I think there's a great opportunity for the board chair or lead independent director to play a really visible role and have a really audible voice in reinforcing that confidence and transparency as needed. When a transition happens, of course, it's always important also to monitor the sentiment post-announcement. What do the social channels say? What does employee engagement data say? What does investor feedback tell you so that you can continue to adapt messaging as needed?
I love that point that you brought up around kind of a way to think about change management and human capital management in that, what is a company? It's people, right? That is who's doing all the work. That is who determines the strategy. That's who's really comprising the organization. But at the same time, kind of the governance of that, the institution that creates itself to organize all of that work and really stick everybody on the core disciplines, and motions and strategy, et cetera, really needs to be balanced so that as you do have the people move in and out, you're really sticking to that core structure and process and governance for that continuity and resilience and stability of the organization.
I think resilience is a great word to use in that. And I think that resilience means different things internally and externally. And the messaging that you provide will support that resilience when you're able to emphasize the things that those different stakeholders need to hear and need to see and need to build trust in accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Makes complete sense. Different stakeholders, different concerns, different anxieties, different priorities. And so the messaging, how you're going to build trust with them, that's it's unique messaging. It's purpose-built. It's intentional.
Yeah. And at the same time, there probably are a lot of consistencies in that message too, in terms of the core, what you're trying to deliver. It just might be a little bit nuanced in terms of how you deliver it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to go back to that point you mentioned before on the total cost of succession and some of those financial metrics. And I think that one of the key opportunities or scenarios where that is the easiest to compare is when it comes to internal candidates versus external candidates. And from the total cost perspective, and you're thinking of time to ramp, cultural disruptions, et cetera, how should the CFOs be navigating some of these impacts? And frankly, what else should they be considering when they're weighing the different succession options?
Well, I would say, internal hires in general would offer lower cost in terms of what that transition looks like because they have such an institutional knowledge and that foundation already established. Therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume that they're going to have a shorter ramp time and perhaps create less cultural disruption. However, if a true transformation is required, an external candidate might bring that needed disruption or bring with them skills that incumbents or the business lacks. So in my mind, I think the CFO has a role in a couple of different avenues. I think that there is an opportunity cost to model when you think about an existing CEO leaving the organization and how they operated and what they were involved in contributing to on a day-to-day basis. If that person leaves the organization, are there revenue impacts? Are there going to be customer retention impacts? Are there going to be other things like that need to be taken into account in financial modeling? Because the new person just won't be the same, of course, might not have the same tendencies and things that they're going to lean more or less into. And an external hire, of course, will take a little bit longer to ramp. I think there's also hidden costs of external transitions to take into account. Of course, there's the opportunity for executive search fees, depending on how you find that replacement CEO. There are probably onboarding investments that need to be made to ensure that the new person, whoever they are, is set up for success and has the support that they need as they come into the role, whether through executive coaching or some consulting that would be done. There is work to be done to support the new leader's cultural acclimation that will need to be measured and evaluated some way. And of course, also potential retention risks across the leadership team. Maybe we can come back to that one. I've got a lot of ideas on the retention side of things. But I think conversely, there is a risk of promoting an underprepared internal candidate that can also impact value. And that, again, ties back to the importance of the CFO being involved in a rigorous succession planning process to make sure that readiness is assessed and accounted for in the overall succession plan, and that internal successor candidates are prepared with the right degree of business acumen and experience to smoothly step into that role.
So we know that leadership transitions impact morale and retention, obviously, for everybody, but especially among key lieutenants. So you mentioned some of the data that finance leaders could be looking at: customer impacts, revenue, retention impacts to incorporate into their financial model. What other data should they be looking at to anticipate some of the risks to either productivity or engagement or, of their own workforce, or even that downstream impact on revenue? And how can they proactively mitigate against those disruptions and risks?
I think finance and HR can work together to identify risks and prepare plans to address morale and retention. There is an opportunity to look at things like deferred compensation cliffs and equity vesting dates as a data point when you're looking at retention, and incorporating those into a transition plan to make sure that key talent stays on board and supports a transition. Employee engagement can, of course, be measured throughout the year, and when you look at trends on a pre- and post-transition basis, compare and contrast those segmented by business unit and seniority. I think that'll tell a strong story of risks that need to be addressed and where there are perhaps morale or retention issues that need to be dug into a little bit further. Through all of that, I think finding a way to evaluate employee confidence and leadership, trust in the direction of the company, and get feedback on the clarity of organizational communication is really important to ensure that the leadership team understands what's going on the ground and can lean in to support, perhaps having to pivot to ensure that their message is hitting the mark differently.
I know you work so closely with Workiva's own CFO, Jill Clint. And so if, you have a captive audience here, you're speaking to a room of finance leaders, what would be your guidance or insight or offer or ask to them of how they could better leverage their chief people officer and HR team to facilitate this succession planning process or strategy?
That is a great question. And I feel like I have been really fortunate to have always had such a great relationship with Jill Clint, our CFO. And we've just been great partners throughout our tenure together at Workiva. And I think a lot of that comes down to being able to be open and honest with each other and having a strong foundation of trust. Being able to trust the confidentiality of our conversations and being able to raise risks and raise opportunities that we both see together, that we can both contribute to together, I think has been such an important part of our relationship and the success that we've established together. And there's things sometimes that finance sees from a straight metric and data and financial result perspective, but I've got a perspective on the human element of that. And I might not see the financial data the same as the CFO would. But when those two things can come together, it just provides such a different degree of clarity on the situation that then you can appreciate and understand the nuances or the risks or the opportunities differently, more holistically. And I think that helps set everybody up for more success.
Emily, Chief People Officer at Workiva, I always love when we get to talk, but truly enjoyed this, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Alyssa. I appreciate it.
Thank you again to our guests, Emily Forrester and Tim Paradis.
And thanks to our guest co-host, Catherine Tsai. This has been The Pre-Read, brought to you by Workiva, developer of the world's only unified platform for financial, sustainability, audit, and risk management.
We've got more insights and hot takes coming your way, so be sure to follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your edge.
If you like the show, leave a review. Send it to someone you love, or just shout it out on your next team call.
We'll be back soon. Until then, go lead it like you mean it.
I'm Alyssa Zucker, and I'm joined by Steve Soder. Segment reporting and production was handled by Catherine Tsai. Our lead producer is Mike Ravagno, with audio support from Joseph Machinsky and Drew Hayes.
Claire Allison is our graphic designer. Transcripts are edited and created by Courtney Kimsey. And thanks to our digital and social team, Mike Berg, Katie Carr, and Michael Karnowski.